Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to today's Society of Decision Professionals Learning Exchange. Today's presentation is Aligning Decisions with Our Values.
The conference is now being recorded.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. One more time, I'd like to welcome you to today's Society of Decision Professionals Learning Exchange. Today's presentation is Aligning Decisions with Our Values. My name is Barbara Metzler, and I'll be your moderator today. If you're not familiar with the Society of Decision Professionals, we are a membership organization with professional members and corporate sponsors, all aligned around a mission to support decision professionals in becoming trusted advisors for decision makers as they face important and complex decisions. I'd now like to introduce you to today's speakers. Somik Raha is our featured speaker. Somik completed his PhD at Stanford in Decision and Risk Analysis in 2010. His dissertation, titled Achieving Clarity on Value, used methods from sociology and philosophy to help discover, appreciate, and communicate sources of value. In particular, his work introduced value diagrams to help decision makers capture their value frames. Based on his doctoral work, Somik is now helping the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation with their Amazon rainforest conservation decisions. Somik is a practitioner in the Society of Decision Professionals. Somik, welcome to today's Learning Exchange.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this. All right.
Welcome. Our other speaker you'll hear from today is Eric Johnson. Eric is a fellow with the Society of Decision Professionals, and he's recently joined the board of directors. Eric has been very active in the Society. He chairs the Portal Council, which has been working to identify and prioritize the Society's website functionality, and he's a contributor to the Body of Knowledge Council. Eric, you're speaking to us from Princeton, New Jersey today. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
All right. Great to have you with us. I'd now like to turn the floor over to our first speaker, Somik Raha. Somik, you have the floor.
Thank you, Barbara. My talk is titled Aligning Decisions with Our Values. And by values, I mean our core values. So before I begin, I'd like to mention that what I'm going to show you is a preamble to decision analysis. So this is what you would typically want to do or think about before any analysis begins. So I'll start with a motivating question, then I'll introduce what I'm calling the dimensions of value, and then share value diagrams and show some case studies. So let's start with a motivating question. So the question for me was, how can we make sure that our decisions are consistent with our core values? And in order to even begin to answer this question, we need to achieve some clarity on value as a first step. So this research, basically what I'm showing you here is a very quick summary of 4 years of research. And so I will spare most of the details, but I'll get to the biggest or the most useful framework that I found in the field of philosophy. It is called formal axiology. And the axiologists are the folks who study value. And they have this very interesting framework which they look at the dimensions of experiencing value. So the first is intrinsic value. These are things that are valuable in and of themselves. Then they have prudential values. These are instrumental values, means to an end, anything that's good for us. And the third is systemic values. These are about concepts, constructs, rules, laws, ideologies, anything that we can count. In fact, any analysis we do is in the space of systems we've created. So all decision analysis, all optimization analyses are in the systemic domain. Another way of understanding this is that intrinsic values relate to our identity. They deeply affect who we are. Prudential values relate to matters of prudence, things that are good for us because of a story we have and to justify this. And systemic values are about systems we've built to manage our thought in an increasingly complex world. So as a quick example, brushing our teeth is prudential, but brushing in the morning and night is a system we've created to get to this prudential value. Another example, valuing the life of a soldier killed in Afghanistan from the perspective of the commanding officer of the soldier. And so when this commanding officer looks at it from the perspective of intrinsic value, he's lost a friend or a colleague who simply can't be replaced. Can't even begin to quantify or talk about trade-offs. It's just too insulting to even pose that question. At the prudential level, it's a pretty bad idea to lose a soldier because now you have to deal with all these practical issues. You have to deal with the bad press, the morale in the troops, informing the family, recruiting more troops, and so on. So practically, it's a bad prospect. And at the systemic level, the statistic of troop deaths went up by 1. So you can see that this is, at the same time, a dimensionality and a hierarchy. So if you look at the same prospect at these 3 different levels, you're reducing the richness as you go from intrinsic to prudential to systemic values. Now, I want to make clear that it's not the case that systemic values are bad. In fact, systemic values are the only ways in which we can create something. So a philosopher once said that the act of creation is basically the act of limitation. When we create a pot, we are limiting the shape the clay can take, and it becomes a pot. So also with ideas, anything we do, we really are creating powerful distinctions which limit what is and what is not. And so limitations are really not the curtailment of our freedom, but it's the highest expression of it. That's how we really manifest our creativity. So it behooves us to create a space between the systems we design and the underlying values which inspire those systems. And so hopefully the idea is that we wouldn't be too stuck up about any one system, and we are more interested in the underlying values, and we are more open and more flexible to change and question our systems. So with that, I'd like to move on to value diagrams, which are a way of showing or communicating these sources of value. By the way, as Barbara has mentioned, if at any time you would like to ask a question, please feel free to type it in the questions box. So the picture that I'm showing here, it is an example adapted from Professor Ron Howard's paper on the foundations of decision analysis, where he talks about direct and indirect values. And here, this example is about an environmentalist in Africa who cares at the intrinsic level about wildlife. And so that is being shown here with a 3-barred thick arrow. So wildlife is an intrinsic value for the environmentalist, but tourism, this person believes, is a prudential value in the sense that the tourists help generate enough money to protect wildlife. So that's shown by the thinner 2-barred arrow. Now, a hotel operator in Africa says, tourism is a good business for me to be in, just like any other business, and I'm doing this for money. So it's a 2-barred arrow. And wildlife is also prudential to tourism because that's why the tourists come here. They come here because they want to see wildlife. So these are 2 value diagrams sharing 2 value stories. Now, a third person, a different hotel operator has a completely different value story. This person says, wait a second, tourism is very important to me. I love helping people see places and bridge cultures. This is a part of my identity. It's an intrinsic value for me, and it's wonderful that I can make money from it, but that's not why I'm doing this. And it's a completely different value story here. And of course, wildlife continues to be a prudential value. So here we've just shared 3 different value frames with this notation. Now we can put in systemic values. For instance, visa regime, which controls who can and cannot come into Africa. And any time we put in a systemic value, I'm going to call that value diagram a constrained value diagram, because we've just constrained our thinking, very clear black and white distinctions with constructs. So, and I'm going to represent that in the diagram with a single thin arrow. Now, as a reminder to this community in particular, most of you have been exposed to decision diagrams. These value diagrams are not solvable analytically, at least not unless we convert this in some way to a decision diagram, which I'll show in a bit. But this is really more evocative to help us understand our values. Other common systemic values that we might put in are budgets or FDA approval. But anything that passes the clarity test, the clairvoyant could answer, that would be a systemic value. Next, I'd like to introduce the idea of a canonical value diagram. And so by canonical, the word canonical is more about what's a little purer form. And in this purer form, I'd like to ban the use of systemic arrows going straight into the value node. And a systemic value must go into an underlying prudential source of value. And similarly, a prudential source of value cannot go in directly to the value node. It must go into an underlying intrinsic source of value. And so the comment is not that this must be so, so, but that forcing decision makers to think about their underlying values helps them uncover deeper and more important values. And so, here's a quick summary. Intrinsic values are really declarations we make. There's no proof needed. In fact, one of the signs that we've probably reached an intrinsic value is people cannot justify why something is important, but it's super important. Prudential values are assertions. They are about evidence, they're about beliefs we've created based on logic, based on some reason. And typically when we treat something as a prudential value, we would want to check why we believe in that. And systemic values are constraints. And oftentimes in life, we are just handed constraints that we have to work within. Now to move to an example, this example is the value diagram of the president of Stanford University, John Hennessy. And this came after a lot of time was spent with the police department. So I was working on public safety decision making, and I created value diagrams for the police chief and then went all the way up to the president to see if these were matching up. And this diagram remarkably was upheld by most of the senior administrators who were related to public safety. So at the prudential level, Stanford expends resources, and that affects the prosperity of the university. But the prosperity of the university is a means to an end, and it matters only because it touches on the intrinsic value of education. And education is really the ground on which we are standing. That's the reason Stanford exists, to teach and to do research. Now, in the context of public safety decision making, all the actions that we take around education have to be traded off with some other things. So, for instance, trauma to the individual, that refers to somebody on campus having a traumatic accident and either losing their life or limbs or being incapacitated. These are terrible things to happen, and the university says we just don't want this happening. There's no justification. It's not about, oh, if we have these accidents, we'll have fewer students next year. That logic doesn't even begin. It's just that we don't want this happening, period. So that's an intrinsic value. And the third intrinsic value they seem to place a lot of emphasis on is coercion of others. And I've kind of put negative signs around them just to show that these are disvalues. So Stanford does not want to coerce other people. They are a voluntary organization, and they want to respect the freedom of others. So at any time, any action that they have to do, they really want to give a lot of thought to, are people going to be forced to do things that we think are right, and can we do this in a more voluntary manner? So those are the three basic intrinsic values of Stanford University.
Somik, let me ask you one question. You've got three intrinsic arrows going into the value box, but Stanford University obviously cares about a number of other items. Those are not shown here?
Yes. So anything that Stanford cares about in the context of a decision is in the space of prudential values. So I can make this diagram as complicated as I want to, but the point was to hone down on the really important ones that will probably stick around for pretty much any decision situation on public safety. So I'll very quickly show you how we can create decision diagrams to capture all the other things that we care about and how they connect to values. So that takes us to achieving consistent valuation. So this is a little case study on evaluating an undergraduate helmet safety program. So it turns out that undergraduates, they have a lot on their mind when they're biking, and a lot of people, they sometimes hit stationary objects, parked cars, and they hurt themselves really badly. And especially if it's an injury on other parts of their body, it's okay, but if it's an injury on the head, that's something that really scares the university, because head is the only organ in our body which doesn't heal our brain. Once our brain is damaged, then that's the end of a lot of our capacities. So the university wants to figure out what they can do to reduce the number of undergraduate head injuries. And so here we are talking about evaluating a helmet safety education program. So in the typical decision diagram notation, you can see that the arrow from the decision to the value node is about the cost. And then we have an influence arrow on the number of undergraduate head injuries, which hopefully should show a change in that distribution for our program to be effective. But what I am most interested in is the red arrow from the head injuries to the value node. How do we value head injuries? And the question here is, how might we draw a decision diagram to be consistent with our value diagram? And I must add that there are many, many ways of doing this. I found that this is a very interesting process. If we start with the value diagram and we start drawing the decision diagram, it gives us one way of doing this. Yes, Barbara, you have a question?
Excuse me, I was on mute. We have one question about, can you have two simultaneous arrows between two nodes? That is, Stanford wants to minimize trauma to individuals intrinsically, but it may also carry about it in a prudential way. That is, we don't want to be sued.
That's a great question, and the answer is yes, you can, and I will show you an example of this as we go along.
Okay. There's a couple other questions. Let me just, how can this be used to inform negotiations? I assume that intrinsic value can't change among parties. If not, then it must be that negotiations could only happen around prudential and systemic. Then which one should negotiators focus on?
That's a great question, and if you don't mind, let's hold off on that one. I want to talk about negotiations at the very end.
Very good.
That's a really good question.
All right, let you go on.
Okay. So let's go back to the value diagram of the president, and I'm going to pop this value diagram into the value node of our decision diagram, which is what we normally play with. And I'm going to go through each element in the decision diagram and see how it relates to these value nodes. So this is more illustrative than an algorithm as such. So let's start with resources expended. So resources expended is really about cost of the program, and that's what the undergraduate helmet safety program arrow to the value node really implies. Prosperity of the university will be subsumed into the cost because that's going to take a negative hit when you spend on public safety, and education ultimately is what's affected because the money you're spending on public safety is money not spent on education. And so cost already is a negative value, so I'm going to treat that as a sufficient indicator of how it affects our education value. Then undergraduate head injuries. Now, there's another aspect, in the decision, undergraduate helmet safety program, we could have alternatives like putting citations on not wearing helmets or banning bicycles for undergraduates. And the first one really stems from the fact that undergraduates think it's very uncool to wear helmets and not realizing they're exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. So because Stanford cares about coercion and doesn't want to coerce others, these two alternatives are off the table. If we ban bicycles for undergraduates, we won't have any more undergraduate head injuries. So let's take these two. So if we keep these two alternatives on the table, we would like to model a coercion risk value from our decision and talk about, well, how much does Stanford have to be paid in order to violate something that's so intrinsic to them. For now, I'm just going to look at voluntary decisions, so we don't have to worry about coercion. And trauma to the individual has no connection with the alternative, but it does have connections to the uncertainty. So we'll now move to the uncertainty and bring back our value diagram. All right, so now resources expended, that is about cost of treatment. So whenever somebody has a head injury, Stanford arranges for the student to be taken to the hospital and emergency care being given. So there's that cost, and that also includes liabilities and things like that. Now, prosperity is again subsumed into cost, but education comes in an interesting way. Because the student has now lost time from their education, Stanford has to expend resources, and Stanford really is not able to help the student get the education they came to get. So are they willing to put some money on the table to not have people lose education time? And the third one is trauma to the individual. So that's about trauma disvalue. And this is about, given that we have taken care of all our liabilities, do we still want to put some money on the table saying we just don't want people having traumatic head injuries on campus? And if you say yes, why would you care? Because this is an intrinsic value for us. And that helps us to put together a very simple value function. And in this incarnation, this is a simple additive value function where I'm just adding all these four elements together. But you could easily imagine why or how this could be a multi-attribute value function as well. I see that there are some questions coming up. Let me stop for a moment. Here, commute. Yeah.
Okay. We have one question, Somik. Do you assign any priority or weighting to the intrinsic values?
Great question. So the moment you assign a priority, it is no longer an intrinsic value. It becomes a systemic value. And yes, we have to assign some kind of trade-offs when we are in the decision diagram land or in the decision analysis land. And what we've just done is we've operationalized this. In other words, we've systematized this. But the moment you do that, you have to pass the clarity test, and you have to draw lines somewhere. So it's very important to recognize that if you can trade off values, they're not intrinsic anymore. And as long as they are undifferentiated in a sense, that's when it stays in intrinsic land.
Okay. I have another question just in terms of your diagram, and just to try to understand why the prudential and systemic bubbles were shown inside a value node earlier and throughout kind of the presentation. So I'm not sure why not have them outside as uncertainties that influence the value.
Again, a great question. So this has to do with keeping the two notations separate. So the value diagrams, I don't want people to confuse them with decision diagrams. And to me, the value node in the decision diagram is where all this action happens. So what I'm really doing is opening the lid on the value node of the decision diagram and showing the philosophical thought process underneath it. And I want to avoid putting systematized or let's just say, value functions in there. I want to keep it as evocative, and that shows the separation that, yes, there's all this philosophical stuff happening, but all of this is meaningless unless we are willing to draw some line somewhere and talk about trade-offs. So I want to keep these two conversations separate, and that's the reason why I want to have the value diagram inside the value node of the decision diagram and not outside. Now, once you've chosen to systematize something as an uncertainty, it has to pass the clarity test, and you're going to count something. And automatically when you count, just think about all the policy analyses where we are trying to reduce the number of head injuries. So what we've just done is we've reduced the value or the life of an individual to a count, a single number, similar to the life of a soldier. Now, if I were to look at this value diagram, I'd say that, wait a second, that doesn't put into the focus the fact that it's a pretty traumatic thing for something like this to happen. And it's not just the number of head injuries that I care about. It's that I'm willing to pay to not have even one. And that's where I start to try to at least achieve the consistency with my deeper values.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. So moving on, let's look at the four values that we came up with. We functionalized into our value function. And for now, I'm going to just keep it simple and assume that Stanford's willing to pay absolutely nothing for education time lost this value. So let's just take it out for simplicity. So what we just did was we incorporated what I'd like to call intrinsic functional values. So we basically functionalized our intrinsic values in one form, and you're perfectly justified to question why in this form and why not in any other form. And that's the exact question I'd like people to ask and question. But there are some things which become very interesting and visible. So as you can see, cost of the program and cost of treatment came out of our thoughts from prudential values. And those prudential values were sitting on top of the intrinsic value of education. So cost of the program and cost of treatment are really connected to our deepest value in education. That's what's taking the hit when you're spending on other things. And the other intrinsic value, trauma to the individual, is directly connected to trauma disvalue. So what I've noticed is when you are functionalizing prudential values, you have to go and get data. So cost of the program is about research on, well, how much does it normally cost? Cost of treatment is, again, from data available. But there's no data in the world which can tell us what a trauma disvalue should be. That's a willingness to pay question. So when you directly functionalize an intrinsic value into an attribute of the value function, that's a willingness to pay question. Whereas the other stuff is an information question. The other big thing that becomes clear is really in these public safety decisions, there are only two values being traded. The two direct values are education and trauma. And our value attribute ultimately is dollars or profits, but it's not in and of itself. It's pegged on top of education. And this has certain interesting implications which we'll get into in a bit. But this clarity was very helpful to us, and we in fact used this. So when I presented this to the Stanford authorities. They said, well, bike safety is great, but our bigger problem on campus is alcohol issues. So freshmen come and they get drunk and they get into alcohol poisoning, and some of them have very serious consequences. So they have this program, an alcohol education program offered by a vendor. I think it's called alcohol.edu. And so the question is, should we buy into this program and mandate that all freshmen should watch this safe alcohol safety module before their admission is confirmed? And so this program has already been in existence at Stanford, and the question was, should we renew this? So our three questions that we kind of grappled with was, what is the value of the alcohol.edu program? What do we need to believe to fund this program? So that is the typical benefit of decision analysis, reverse engineering our beliefs. Third, what is the value of a research module that this vendor was providing, sharing research across the country on alcohol safety, but that came with a price tag. So at what point should we say, yeah, we'd like to buy the extra module as well? And for me, what is most interesting was the underlying question behind all these three questions, which is, how do we make decisions that are consistent with our deepest values? And so we used pretty much the same value diagram as the one I showed you earlier, Stanford's diagram. And I'm going to skip several steps and just show you the decision diagram that emerged from this conversation. And so we had the cost of alcohol EDU on the left, which is coming out of the decision, which is pretty, known that, okay, it's $18,000. Now, if you look at the two big things that people worry about, they're the minor alcohol safety incidents and the major ones, the traumatic injuries. So the minor ones have cost prudential elements associated with it. That's staff time, 911 response costs, ER costs, and so on. But then they also have the classes missed this value, which is coming out of the intrinsic value placed on education. So I've labeled that as an E. And if you look on the right, the traumatic injury, that has PR costs and litigation costs. These are prudential, connected prudential considerations. And so there we have a lot of data. So it turns out MIT spent $6 billion to settle somebody who got drunk and jumped off the building and really hurt themselves, and the family felt MIT should have done better. So we decided, okay, we'll take it as $2 million per incident as our liability cost. But then there's the trauma risk value, which is the amount of money that Stanford's willing to put on the table to not have this happen to anybody. And then we also have the classes missed this value, which is connected with the intrinsic value based on education. And this is much higher for traumatic injuries, where people can lose years of their life, and and sometimes even lose their life. So putting all of this together, so we were able to come up with a decision, but then we said, well, let's go one step further. So in decision analysis, if you look at the impact of our pet ideas on an uncertainty of interest, anything we do will have a shift in the distribution. So it's very important to de-bias ourselves. So we introduced the chance of success. And only if we are successful, then these distributions of minor incidents and traumatic incidents will shift. The question is, what do we need to believe about the chance of success for us to say yes to this program? And it turns out when we did put all the numbers in, as long as the decision maker believed that there'd be a 14% chance of success, they should go ahead with it, which really was a big surprise for us. Yeah. Barbara, you have a question?
Yes, Somik, we have one question just relating back to Stanford's idea that it does not want to coerce people into behavior. How is mandating an alcohol education program different than enforcing helmet wear through citations? Aren't they both coercions?
At one level, yes, but then remember that Stanford is a private property-based institution, so they, in other words, if you don't buy into their laws, you can choose not to come to Stanford. Whereas in many other situations in society, if you don't like a new law somebody's creating, you just have to live with it, which is kind of the situation with public property.
So this was an education module that they had to complete before their acceptance was actually confirmed.
That is correct. This is not after the fact you're learning, oh, this is something you have to suddenly do. This is before your admission is contingent on the fact that you take this module and you certify that you have understood and you recognize that you should think about your own safety when drinking alcohol. So it was more so education. It's more of a contract thing, as in you fulfill this part of the contract, then we let you in and you can be here. So it is in fact, it's one of the it's a very paradigmatic shift on enforcement, and I believe we'll see more of this in the future because it's the one thing that's really there's this famous thinker, Cesar Beccaria, who in the 1800s said that the one way to really bring down crime in society is through education, and yet that's the one thing that we almost never pay attention to.
One related question had to do with the chance of success. Did you say it was 40 or 14?
No, 14.
14. Okay, and were you surprised by that chance of success? Did you believe it would be higher or lower before, as you were going into this?
So I should mention that the 14% chance was a sensitivity analysis thing. When we did the elicitation, I think we put in a 50% chance of success. But then when we reverse engineered and we try to find out, well, what do you need to believe for us to say yes? It turned out to be 14. And that gave the decision maker a lot of confidence that, hey, it's definitely above 14%.
All right.
Yeah.
Very good.
Okay. Now, here's the fun part of this whole thing, that we can now start to do what you might call, half-jokingly as ethical sensitivity analysis. So here I have the two intrinsic values that Stanford places. One is on trauma disk value, the other is education time loss disk value. And I think I rigged up this case just to be a little more interesting. So in this particular case with the numbers, all the prudential values the way they were, it turns out that you'd say yes to the program only if Stanford placed a trauma disk value of $400,000 or greater and nothing on education time lost, or $400,000 on education time lost and nothing on trauma, or $200,000 on both, and somewhere in between, as you see in the diagonal. So this kind of shows these numbers in the box are the benefit to cost ratios. So they show you when it's green, that's when you would go ahead and make this investment. So suddenly the conversation is now about our willingness to pay and at what point should you say yes to the program. And one thing that comes up here often is, people have done things or researches on value of life and what number we should put on this. But what I find most useful is an idea which Bruce Judd had presented, had raised in his dissertation in 1977, where he said that it's not really about the precise value of life that we want to put in. It's about reverse engineering your decision and finding out what do you need to believe. If the implied value of life has to be a minimum at this level for us to say yes, the question is, do we all agree that it's at least this much? And if it is at least this much, we don't have to have the philosophical discussion anymore. We just go ahead with the decision. So that's how I chose to resolve it. Instead of going with one hard and fast number, the discussion was more on, is it at least this much or not? So this was actually used. This is a little snippet from the Stanford Daily where the director of alcohol education, Ralph Castro, this has been getting a lot of attention. He talked about his decision, and in fact, he says that he cited, as you can see in the red box, he cited a decision-making model, and so used that to justify his decision. And so that was quite useful, and a lot of decision makers looked at it. And what we really did was we opened up the entire thought process behind the decision, including talking about our core values and how we chose to operationalize them. So one thing that comes up often is people say that, hey, you shouldn't talk about your core values, or some people, I've been asked this question before, that don't people get turned off? But what I found is when I gave a talk at the Alcohol Advisory Board, people got really emotional hearing about these core values, saying that this is what we need in our analyses. We care about these things, but we never talk about it in our math. And so they were really happy that this was included. Robert, do you have a question?
We just wanted to ask, there was something about putting the value on an incident or something like that. It's interesting because I've often heard that one of the difficulties is that people don't want to put value on a life or traumatic injury or something. How can you put a value on such a thing? What was your experience here?
Yeah, so this goes back to what I just mentioned about Bruce Judd's idea that it's not necessary that we have to place a precise value in life, but if we find that the implied value of life for us to say yes to this decision is so far below what we would actually do, would say, yeah, it's at least $10,000 value that I'm willing to, and it's not so much the value of somebody's life, it's how much I'm willing to pay for this person not to have a traumatic outcome. And if I find, yes, I'd be willing to pay at least $10,000 for somebody not to have a serious head injury, then I don't need to engage in that philosophical discussion on what number to put. Say, yeah, it's above this, and we can all agree on it and make the decision. So going forward, now I'm going to take a little segue and get into the non-analytic part of this, and that's how we can extend the value conversation in organizations with value diagrams. And the aim is to create mutual understanding on our value frames. And I'll show two case studies. One is in the organizational context, and the other is in a political conflict. So this was done with the police chief at Stanford University, where she was interested in knowing what her lieutenants understood of her values. And so I interviewed her lieutenants and asked them, do you know what your boss cares about? And let's see how you would draw her value diagram. And so these two lieutenants had just joined the department from another one. So the process was a lot longer. I asked them to draw the value diagram of the previous department, the current department, from the chief's perspective and from their perspective. And I'll just show a snapshot of one lieutenant's value diagram. So the one at the bottom is the lieutenant's value diagram according to himself. And he says that, hey, I care about enforcement of the law because it is prudential. It prevents harm to people. That's what I believe. And harm to people is an intrinsic disvalue. I don't want people to be harmed. I also care about service, people being served. And so because I place a very high value on service, I think that's one of the things that Stanford's department also places a high value on. That's one of the reasons I was hired. And I really don't like coercion. Coercion is a really bad value for me. And so they're really the police are really trading off harm to people with coercion. So if they use coercion, it's only when there's no other way out. And somebody had asked about a node having different kinds of arrows. So this is an example of that, where you can see how coercion has an intrinsic link. It also has a prudential link. When you coerce others, you're not really serving them well. So that's the prudential part that it doesn't really help. Now, the same lieutenant, when he was asked to draw the police chief's diagram, he said that it looked pretty similar, except that he felt the police chief had an intrinsic arrow from enforcement of law to value, and did not have an intrinsic arrow from coercion to value. And so I showed this to the police chief and asked her, well, what do you think? And she said, that's kind of interesting. I understand where he's coming from. And it turns out that the police chief does not have an intrinsic value in enforcement. What she was trying to communicate was that enforcement matters for reasons of equity. So someone from East Palo Alto, which is a rundown neighborhood in this area, should be treated at the same level as a Stanford student. She doesn't want the police to give any special treatment to Stanford students, and she wants equity to be an important consideration. That's what she was trying to explain. And so that we teased out that value because of this disconnect. And second, she clarified, no, coercion has an intrinsic disvalue for me. And this is a simple example how this back and forth can get people to agree on the organizational values that they choose to serve. Next, I'll share a political one. So I did two case studies. One was the U.S.-Iran standoff, and I interviewed some people who are pretty high up in the previous administration, but I'd rather not name them. But I'll show you the China-Tibet one, which is, I think, very interesting. So I interviewed the envoy of the Dalai Lama, who was on campus, and I also interviewed a Han Chinese subject. And so what you're seeing here is the Dalai Lama's value diagram according to the Han Chinese subject. And so he says, well, I think the Dalai Lama cares about Western democracy merely as a prudential value because it helps him in his diplomacy, and diplomacy is important for him because he's really after Tibetan independence. That's his intrinsic value. And he wants to continue the Dalai Lama institution. That's an intrinsic value for him. Tibetan Buddhism is an intrinsic value for him. Returning to Tibet in his own lifetime is also an intrinsic value for him. So then I pointed out that 3 of the 4 intrinsic values that he talked about, they violate the canonical form because they are constructs. They're very clear. We know when Tibet has been recognized as an independent country. We also understand continuation of the Dalai Lama institution, and returning to Tibet in his own life and is also pretty clear. These are all systemic values. So he just reduced the Dalai Lama's intrinsic values to systemic ones. Next, I asked the envoy of the Dalai Lama, what do you think he cares about? So he says, well, expression of Tibetan identity is an intrinsic value for him. Expression of Buddhism is an intrinsic value for him. And expression of world citizenship is also an intrinsic value. Now, he cares about economic and cultural freedom because it supports the Tibetan identity and Buddhism. And nonviolent action is very important for him because that promotes economic and cultural freedom. But to get to nonviolent action, we need a nonviolent mindset. And the nonviolent mindset also helps us accept Chinese rule. And that is important because, first, it connects with the expression of world citizenship, because we could be anywhere in the world. We don't mind being within China. And second is it will also trigger Chinese compassion, which will support economic, cultural freedom and expression of Buddhism. And what distinguishes the Dalai Lama from other Marxists, he calls himself a Marxist monk. But what distinguishes him is he doesn't believe at all in coercion, and that's because coercion is a fundamental and intrinsic disvalue for him. And he feels nonviolent action, Chinese compassion, will support that as a negative value. So, and he also keeps saying he wants to benefit from the strength of the Chinese. So I showed this to the Han Chinese subject, and he said, well, so you had one comment. One is that economic freedom does not necessarily lead to expression of the Tibetan identity. But then he had this other comment where he said that Uyghurs are very entrepreneurial, but not the Tibetans. They're very laid back because of their religion, and 20% of the society are monks, which is very bad for production. So in order to understand where he was coming from, drew his own value diagram, and he claimed that this is shared with most Han Chinese. And at the intrinsic level, he said it was really about development of Tibet. That was an intrinsic value for them. And production, they believe, would help the development, and monastic culture will reduce production, hence it was bad. So I showed this to the Tibetan subject, and he said, well, the monastic education and the culture promotes a more peaceful society and more compassionate actions within that society. That's the basis of ethics and positive education. And then he says, I know China is all about booming development, but are they enough for the stability and long-term health of society? So they had this back and forth now, and they kind of started to understand each other. And so I went back to the Han Chinese subject and said, you said development is your intrinsic value, but in the canonical form, that cannot be, because you can easily answer for me why development is important. He said, yeah, I can give you many reasons. Well, then it's not intrinsic. So you have to find something intrinsic for me that you cannot justify. And it came to a point where he said, okay, fine, what do you think is the intrinsic value for me? So then I suggested, based on everything I'd heard from him, that he really cared about the well-being of all Chinese within the entire Chinese country, and that included Tibetans. And so he was really after well-being of all. And when I suggested that, he became very silent, and then he said, you're right. So the Chinese have this term called guojia, which is shown on the left with the Chinese characters, and guojia means nation family. So that's the term which is embedded in the Chinese consciousness. And so this kind of explains why the Chinese sometimes get very touchy about anybody who criticizes the nation idea, because the nation is really like a family, and you would protect your family. And the positive side of that is that Tibetans are also a part of that family, and they really want the well-being genuinely of the Tibetans. And they feel that the world doesn't respect that or doesn't believe that. So there's this huge disconnect there. And the other fascinating side of this was he felt that, or this was a big surprise for me, he felt that the Chinese are very ostracized for exposing any comment which is contrary to the mainstream position in the United States. And so if they would say that they don't support Tibet or the Dalai Lama, their independence, then they find that people criticize them, and they will see a negative fallout of their actions wherever they are. So they feel very afraid to speak out. So that was actually news to me, and I found that there's a lot of hurt on both sides, and particularly the Chinese one doesn't come out as much. So this experience was a very big learning experience for me, and one thing I discovered was when we get closer and closer to the intrinsic values, people tend to get more and more silent because they're really experiencing something deeper. And that's another sign when we're drawing these diagrams that we're actually getting somewhere. So at this point, before I show the next part, the last part of what I have today, I'd like to throw a little poll question. So using the Q&A tool, I'd like you to reflect on what is the goal of a business.
So ladies and gentlemen, if you please open your Q&A tool and drag it to your desktop, then you can type your question in the Q&A box and just hit the word ask, and we will be able to see some of those come in as they do. So we'll take a moment here just to go ahead and type your answer to the question about what is the goal of the business.
As you're typing, this is more about, well, do any of these ideas have any relevance for a typical business environment?
Okay, we're starting to see a handful of responses come in, and I'm capturing some of these on the slide here today.
So this is great. It's great to see the diversity, and as Barbara is copying this, I'd like to share a little story. So the very first time that I heard about the goal of a business was when I was 15 years old, and this was in India. And as you know, India is a strange country, a lot of diversity, and a very deep monastic culture. And so there was a monk who had been invited by a business to give a talk on what is business. Can you imagine that? So the monk was defining for us what is the idea of a business. And the first thing he said was, a business is basically about service. That is the definition of a business. And so we are here to serve others, as many of you are saying here. And people, out of tremendous gratitude for that service, they compensate us. And so that compensation is bound to come if you're serving, but we should not focus on the compensation exclusively. It will come. Our entire goal is to stay true to our value, which is to serve others. Now, that's a fascinating idea of a business, and it was, I mean, ever since I heard that definition, I've always been confused by the other definitions I heard in business school and elsewhere. And so that, yeah, there are the typical ones to provide material benefit to owners and to create value for shareholders. But I'm going to throw out a provocative thought. I don't think anyone who starts a company who spends a little bit of time thinking about this would agree that they're really all about providing value to shareholders. There is something deeper going on, and let me share that with the next slide. So this is a friend, an entrepreneur who's doing this company on mobile services, and he met me and he said, "Oh, what are you doing?" And I said, "I'm thinking about values these days and value diagrams." And we said, "Okay, let's try to draw his value diagram." So he comes to the meeting and he says with a long face, "Somik, I don't think I have any values." And so I said, "Well, let's find out. So what do you care about in this startup?" So he says, "Well, I care about lower transmission costs." So he was trying to reduce the cost of transmission in the cellular networks, and ease of deployment, financial efficiency. These three things I really care about. Well, let's see. So why do you care about lower transmission costs and ease of deployment? So he says, "Oh, well, they're Prudential. They help me give cheaper access to mobile services." Well, why do you care about that? So it turns out that he wants to remove one pain from people's lives. Why do you care about that? Well, because I want to live meaningfully. And you can't justify that any further. That's the intrinsic value. Okay, what about financial efficiency? Well, financial efficiency helps us support our employees. Why do you care? Well, it helps other people come alive at, doing something meaningful. And again, it comes down to living meaningfully. So he's really sitting on top of a very fundamental value, living meaningfully, where all this time he thought he was about creating shareholder value. So that's just, that blew my mind. I didn't expect this, and neither did he. So needless to say, he went back with a big smile. But this kind of draws our attention to what I would suggest is far beyond a for-profit or a non-profit paradigm. It's a beyond profit paradigm. If you think about service in your own lifetimes, you might question how many times you have patronized the values that someone's sharing with you as opposed to their concrete service. For instance, I have a mechanic who almost never, whenever I take my car in, this guy, he just refuses to charge me unless there's something majorly wrong for it. And I have to fight with him to accept money. And at the same time, I have this name brand company. Every time I go there, I end up losing at least $1,000 or $1,500, and I find out I've been ripped off. And of course, I would prefer to take my business to the guy who really wants to serve me. And so this has a very strong practical implication that when we want to serve others in a selfless manner, it turns out that money comes and falls at our feet. The best strategies just become very evident. And we'll see it again and again, whether it's companies like Google or even Facebook. The recent movie that's out, one thing that struck me in that was that although the founder had a lot of uncharitable issues going on around him, one thing he never cared about was making money. And yet, he's one of the wealthiest people around. So that's something to give us some pause, that when we think about service, think about coming alive, how is it that we make the most money that way? And shouldn't that be a part of our strategic decision-making apparatus? So in conclusion, decision analysis has all these tools for framing and formulating what our decision is. And just as the decision diagram is known to us as a visual language to develop clarity about decisions, I propose value diagrams as a visual language to develop clarity on value. And some more uses to this. One is, as I mentioned, it's a precursor to any analysis. And the second one is negotiation. And if somebody asked a very nice question, how do you use this in a negotiation? My thinking is that this, when you go into a negotiation, there's absolutely no reason to hide your intrinsic values. In fact, just imagine if you walked into a negotiation and you shared your deepest intrinsic values, and then you had the conversation. The whole frame can change. Whereas, I want to get pennies out of the other person. That's a very restricted frame. So that's one thought. That why, if you start from a perspective of values, maybe you're not negotiating anymore. In fact, there are companies that I know of which take this attitude that if we are here to serve, if there's one eye hospital, the biggest eye hospital in the world, they have this strategic initiative where they say that we are here to remove needless blindness, and that means all our competitors are really our partners. So they literally educate and train their competitors so they can improve their efficiency because they're all in this together. And of course, they do very well financially as well. So with that, thank you so much for listening.
All right. Thank you, Somik. Before we move on to our meeting of the Society of Decision Professionals, I'll just raise a couple of questions here that came up. One question, which you may have addressed when you talked about your experience with the entrepreneur, but would you please discuss how you elicited the value diagrams? You said, for example, that he cared about XYZ. How did you structure a conversation? How does this contrast with methods to move up or down in an objectives hierarchy?
So the way I've drawn, so I'm still learning how to draw value diagrams, so that's the honest answer, and it's different for different people, but I've generally found that it doesn't help to ask people what are their intrinsic values, but what's much more useful is to ask them what they care about, what's important, and then keep asking them why. And at a certain point, when I think I've got the deepest values, then I try to do some checks with the canonical form that are they using something systemic as though it were intrinsic. And that's kind of interesting because so where this framework comes from is from the work of Robert Hartman, who escaped Nazi Germany, and he was very interested in creating an intellectual framework by which people would never confuse themselves and use other people. So the question there is are the values that we hold intrinsically, are they an ideology which are going to use other people, or are they going to use other human beings as means to an end? And if we are making those, making those judgments, then we're making a very deep mistake in our value thinking. And so one of the aims in drawing the value diagram is to make sure that people avoid those mistakes. For instance, that's what I showed in the political example. So humans are not meant to be used for some ideology or as a means to an end. So that's something you would check. Now with the objective hierarchy, so this is, like I said, it's a precursor to analysis, and in fact, this definitely does not contradict anything that Keeney has done and other people have done. In fact, it complements it. So I would I would definitely get into that trade-off conversation. There's a lot to be learned from the work with the multi-attribute camp on how to structure and how to draw the lines once we know what is it that we care about. But this is more about discovering what we care about, and so identifying what our sources of value really are.
Okay. Just two more questions. One just came in. I'd like your thoughts on how this approach is fundamentally different from a means-ends objective hierarchy.
Sort of similar to the previous one. So one way in which it differs is in drawing, so instrumental values and intrinsic values, like same as direct values and indirect values, as Professor Howard would call it, and Professor Keeney would call it strategic objectives and means objectives. Now, the difference is the distinction of the systemic values, and that's, I think, what's new. And that's very fundamental, because everything that we're doing when we systematize something is that we are reducing something which is so rich, which can only be experienced, cannot really be explained, and we are drawing very sharp lines around it. And that's the one thing, that distinction really transforms and shows us that everything we're doing with our analytical methods is ultimately not going to really be about what we experience as value. And that gives us a lot of philosophical pause, and that gives us a lot of freedom to step back and create other systems or look at other systems. And that's the difference.
Okay. Last question is just, can you share the name of that mechanic who said that he doesn't want to take any money from you?
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's 9-minute Oil and Lube on El Camino and Ventura.
Very good. Well, Somik, this has been a wonderful presentation. I thank you so much for volunteering to present this with our third learning exchange of the Society of Decision Professionals. Please stay on the line just a moment as we transition to our short meeting of the Society of Decision Professionals. I'm going to take a moment now and just end our recording and end our recording of the moment, and then I will introduce our next speaker.
Conference recording has stopped.